Mounce, BBG, Chapter 14, Sentence 1. Hope you're sitting with your cup of coffee and settled in, because this one is quite a challenge. Going to take us a little bit to go through it. There's so much to say. So in case, we'll go ahead and get started. I'll give you a couple hints when you're working Chapter 14 and forward. A couple of hints. Number one is one of the big helps you can give yourself is to separate out the relative clause from the rest of the sentence so that you can more easily, number one, work with the relative clause, and number two, work more easily with the rest of the sentence. Because obviously a relative clause, once you yank it out, the rest of the sentence should make perfect sense without it. So in this case, I'll just tell you, essentially whoops, sorry about that. Relative clause is right here. And once you yank that out, then you're left with this and the rest of the sentence. So let's go ahead and start working through the sentence without the relative clause, and then maybe we can come back and look at both the relative pronoun and the relative clause. Hopefully make things easier for you. Number one, ta remata. Hopefully you know that the vocabulary word by now is rema. So as soon as you know that the vocabulary word is rema, and then you see remat, you ought to know that that's a mat stem. That tells you that it's neuter. Also tells you that it's plural. And then you have to say, well, okay, I know it's neuter plural. I see that alpha on both the definite article and the noun itself. It tells me that it's either nominative or accusative. So not knowing which is the case, let's just take it for what it is and say the words, since we know, again, it's neuter plural. We see the words, and then we take the rest of the sentence. Again, I'm just going to yank that relative clause right out of there and deal with the rest of the sentence first, and then we'll come back. So the words, and then you know you have spirit, and you know you have life, right? And the word and, so spirit and life, and then you have these two verbs, esten twice. Well, those are it might throw you because both of those are third singular and look like they line up really, really well with pneuma and zoe as subjects. So you might be tempted to say spirit is and life is. But the problem with that is that you've got ta remata, and then you say, well, okay, spirit is and life is the words. Well, you could do that. Easier move is to take ta remata as the subject, which means that you'd want to take it as a nominative. And then what you're going to do, since you know pneuma and zoe, especially zoe, are nominatives, you go, okay, well, we got an equative verb with esten. So let's treat those as predicate nominatives. The problem that you still have is that you have a third singular verb in both cases with esten occurring twice. And you go, well, how does that line up if ta remata is plural and I got a singular verb? Well, here's the trick you don't know. The trick you don't know is that often in Greek, if you have a neuter plural subject, it will take a singular verb. Big deal. Write it down. A neuter plural subject in Greek will often take a singular verb. The reason that's the case is it's sort of like certain words in English where we do the same thing. The group is going to the store. Well, group is more than one, but we treat it as though it's a single thing. My family is great. Well, family is more than one person. So, consequently, my point is that we do this similar thing in English, and you just need to sort of remember that rule that quite often you can have like I said, a neuter plural subject. So again, we're going to treat that as a nominative, and it will line up with its predicates but have a singular verb. So again, before we get to the relative clause, what you're going to have is the words, and then you're going to translate this as are, even though it's singular, because when we translate words, we need a plural verb. So that's where you're going to do a little bit of a shift in order to make it line up, and that's okay, because again, that's just the way Greek does that, sort of like we do group and family and words like that. So the words are spirit and are life. Okay, so that's the rest of your sentence before you get to the relative clause. Now we look at the relative clause, and we see the relative pronoun ha. And if you didn't know any better and you're kind of going, okay, what do I do with that? You pull out your Mounce laminated sheet right there in the front corner. You've got the relative pronoun, and that can only be one of two things. It can only either be neuter, plural, nominative, or accusative. One of those two. So then you look at the rest of the sentence and you just say which. Ego, I, of course. He gives you the verb, is I have spoken. That lines up with the I as a subject. Then you have whom in, and hopefully you've memorized your second person personal pronouns, and you know that that is a dative, and the giveaway there ought to be that iota, which again tells you that it's dative. So it's to you. So which I have spoken to you is the relative clause. You still got to figure out what on earth that relative pronoun is doing and how it functions within the sentence, because that's really the big deal in Greek. With a relative pronoun, like a lot of other things, you have a lot of other nouns. You have case, number, gender, and the way you play the game, and I'll go over this on every sentence, but I'll introduce it in sentence one. The way you're going to play the game is case. You look right to how it functions within the clause, the relative clause. Number and gender, you look left to the antecedent. All right. So number and gender, you know that it's plural. Gender, you know it's neuter because it's lining up with ta fremata, and you know fremata is a mat stem, so that makes it a neuter noun. So you know number and gender line up with the antecedent, which is ta fremata. Case, though, you got to look right, because you're looking at the same ending, but you're going, well, wait a minute, just like ta fremata could be either nominative or accusative, ha can either be nominative or accusative, so I have to line that up with how it functions within the relative clause. Relative clause is I have spoken to you. So can ha be in the nominative case, which means it's replacing the subject within the relative clause? It cannot. The reason is because you already have ego functioning as a subject, which you know is nominative, so you can't have ha functioning as a nominative or a subject within the relative clause, which I have spoken to you. The other part of that equation is you say, well, okay, since I know it's accusative, that means it's replacing the direct object. Does that make sense? Well, again, the relative pronoun embeds the antecedent sort of into the relative clause, such that if you take the antecedent and you replace it and you put it into the relative clause, it should fit in based on the case of the relative pronoun. So we know the words is the antecedent. So if we take the relative clause and say, I have spoken the words to you, then we see that the words clearly functions as a direct object, which makes sense then that the ha would be in the accusative case. So hopefully that makes sense to you. Once again, case, number, gender. Case, you're going to look right. Number, gender, you're going to look left to the antecedent. Okay? So again, the relative clause, which I have spoken to you, the which is going to be in an accusative case, number one, because it can't replace the subject, which we already have. Number two, because it makes perfect sense for him to embed words into the relative pronoun within that relative clause is something like I have spoken the words to you. Okay, so that ha again is direct object. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys. The words which I have spoken to you, our spirit and our life, would be your best translation there.